Welcome to the lecture for this week, which I've called All or Nothing. And in this lecture, what I want to do is to build on the work we've been doing over the last 2 weeks, particularly in week 2, and the work in the book chapter out of Introduction to Occupation, which included a lot of new terms and concepts that help us understand what people do and why they do it and how they do it. And I would like to bring that together to finally think about what is occupation, so that we can start to be very clear about how we use that term and what we mean by that term. One of the things that is frustrating for some is that there are almost as many definitions of occupation as there are occupational therapists, perhaps not quite, but almost. And while some people see that as a very healthy thing for a profession to be reflecting on and debating and being critical about some of the key concepts in our field, other people find that quite frustrating. However, it is really useful and interesting to look at those definitions, and I just want to give you a few interesting concepts that have come out of some of those definitions before I move on to think about, or to tell you about how I think we should be thinking about occupation. So first of all, one of the issues that comes up in some of the definitions and some of the literature about occupation is that it's seen as those ordinary and familiar things that people do on an everyday basis. While it's very true that those everyday, ordinary and familiar things that people do are occupations, what this raises questions about are those things which people do more infrequently. And in fact, some of those things might only be done once in a lifetime, and so you could argue from this perspective that those things aren't occupations, and that's not the case. One of the things that's clear in lots of the literature and lots of the definitions is that occupations are active. It involves active process. They involve active processes. They're the ways we occupy ourselves, make our place, and so require us to do. And that's very common in the definitions. One of the other things which is interesting, because usually occupation is seen very much as an individual undertaking, that we do them individually, although we do them in a whole range of contexts, which we'll come on to a bit later. We certainly do things individually, but what more and more people are recognising in the literature in occupational therapy and occupational science is that we do things as groups as well. And sometimes they might be very small groups, but they might be very large groups as well, in fact, whole societies. And just think about what are some of those things that you do individually, and can you think of things that you do as part of large groups, and even what's something that our society engages in collectively. What's also pretty clear in the literature is that occupations are named within a particular context. They happen within a particular context or contexts usually, and that's really important in terms of recognising what is an occupation and how people in that particular group, that culture, or within those contexts make sense of that experience that people are having. So there's lots of ideas out there in the literature. What I have done is gone through and looked at lots of the definitions of occupation, as well as a whole range of research about occupation, and not come up with a single definition, but rather come up with what I've called the nature of occupation, which is the book chapter that you are reading this week. So the nature of occupation suggests that all occupation is active, is purposeful, is meaningful, is contextualized, and impacts on health. And I'll go through each one of those and just talk a bit more about them. First of all, in terms of occupation is active, as I sort of hinted at earlier, occupation is active in that it requires us to use our capacities and our abilities. And that includes our physical abilities, such as range of motion, muscle strength, coordination, but also our mental capacities, for example, cognition, problem solving, memory, and a whole range of other things. So all occupation is active, and what can happen sometimes is that we can be engaged physically in one thing, but mentally engaged in something else. So it doesn't always have to be the case that we're physically and mentally doing the same thing, and there's an example in the book chapter about that. What's also important to think about in terms of being active is that here's this man sitting doing nothing in terms of He's not up and about, he's not walking, he's not writing, he's not throwing a ball around, he's not even talking to anybody else. So at some level it looks like he's doing nothing, but one of the things that we need to pay more attention to, I think, is that occupation can be very active mentally. And so, for example, this man could be sitting there thinking about all sorts of things, about the sailing boat in the distance or the tanker over in the other side of the picture. And so physically he might not be doing anything, but mentally he could be very active. And so both of those things are fine. And if you think about your life, I'm sure you can think of things where you're physically very active and sometimes where you're physically not active, but mentally very active. So in all of those ways, occupation is active. One of the other things about occupation is that all occupation is purpose. It has some reason or purpose, and there are a few ways to think about that. One of the most common ways that occupational therapists think about it, and you'll get used to these three terms, is that the purpose of occupation is sometimes thought of as self-care or productivity or leisure, and rest is sometimes added in there as a fourth one. So self-care are all those things we do to look after ourselves. Productivity are all those things we do to contribute to society, and that might include looking after other people. It might include paid employment or voluntary work. And leisure are all those things that we do for relaxation and pleasure. So the purpose of an occupation could be any one of those, and perhaps even a combination of those, which we'll be thinking a bit more about later in the week. Anne Wilcock is someone who has thought a bit differently about the purpose, and she's taken a whole species view. So what those purposes I outlined in the previous slide are very much about individual purpose. Anne Wilcock has talked about the purpose of occupation at a species level, could be seen as to provide for immediate bodily needs of sustenance, self-care and shelter. Slightly individual, but it's about providing that for those basic needs. It might also be about developing skills, social structures and technology aimed at safety and superiority over predators and the environment. So we engage in occupation so that we can master the environment, be safe and be superior over predators, although that clearly is less of an issue these days, but because her work took very much has looked historically at humans and occupation. And finally, to exercise personal capacities to enable maintenance and development of the organism. And the term she uses here, which I think gets across the message, is to enable the organism to flourish. Okay. So slightly different, rather than self-care, productivity and leisure. These are slightly different ways of thinking about purpose. And it will depend on the occupation you're looking at, the person you're working with, as to which of these will be useful. But all about the purpose of occupation. Another aspect of occupation is that all occupation is meaningful, and there are a few things here really to think about. First of all, that meaning is very individual. So there's an image here of people in church. We can make all sorts of assumptions about the meaning that occupation has for those people, and we might be right, but there's a significant risk that we won't be right as well. And so when trying to think about why is somebody engaging in something, what's the meaning of that occupation for that individual or for that group of people, we need to talk to them and understand it from their perspective. We shouldn't make assumptions because it can be very unique to them. And the other thing is that it can change over time. So doing an occupation, what looks like the same or similar occupation, on two different occasions might have two very different meanings. So for me, for example, cooking dinner one night when I get home late from work, it's just about cooking dinner so that I can have some food. Whereas it's a very different situation when I'm cooking for friends or my parents or somebody else. Meaning is important because it's what motivates performance and engagement in occupation. And it's one that is often hard to get to because you've got to ask lots of why questions and you've got to talk to the person, but it's actually a really important one. Another one is that occupation is contextualized, and in a few weeks we'll be thinking a lot more about the whole range of contexts, and context is something we talked about quite a bit in week 2. So all occupation happens within multitude of contexts. And some of those might be, for example, the physical context, the social context, the political context, the organizational context, and we can go on and on. There are lots of different contexts. The important thing about context is that it's a two-way relationship between the context and the occupation. So the contexts shape the occupation, and the occupations shape the context. And it's really important to think about both of those because it is a two-way relationship. One of the things to think about context is that they can have a very significant impact on somebody's on somebody's occupations in terms of the range of occupations available to them, the type of occupations available to them, or even how people do a similar occupation. They might do it very differently because of context, and I think this picture is one that sums up one aspect of that. The final one is that occupation influences health. What's interesting is that the profession of occupational therapy was founded on this belief, and there's now growing evidence for that, which we'll talk about in a second. But lots of the literature sort of takes this for granted and doesn't mention it explicitly. And the assumption is that occupation impacts on health in a positive way, that occupation is good for your health. There's some literature starting to emerge now that is recognising that that may not always be the case, that some occupations have a detrimental impact on people's health or the health of groups of people. And so, for example, thinking about young people who binge drink or people who use drugs, thinking about that is actually really complex in terms of the impact on their health, and thinking about it from an occupational perspective, because just thinking about some of those things we've talked about in terms of purpose, meaning, active, context, there's a whole range of things, reasons, rationales, influences as to why somebody might engage in those. So occupation influences health, most definitely, but whether it's positive or negative depends on the situation of the person, the individual, and so forth. That then is a really brief overview of the nature of occupation. So occupation is active, purposeful, meaningful, contextualized, and impacts on health. And one of the important things to take away is that for an occupation to be considered such, it has all of those things. All occupations are active, purposeful, meaningful, contextualized, and impact on health. Okay? Now, it's not that they all have lots of them, lots of those characteristics. So, for example, some occupations might have a tiny bit of meaningfulness, and some might be much more meaningful and significant. But every occupation has some meaning for somebody, just as it has all of those other things as well. Now, what's important to think about is that this isn't just a bunch of academics making this up and thinking this is a good idea, that occupation is a nice concept. Although, as I said just a few minutes ago, that's how the profession started. People believed it was a good idea. We now have research that shows that this is the case. I've deliberately chosen, I'm just going to show you two pieces of research, deliberately chosen two old ones because I think one of the things the profession needs to think about is this research has been out there for a while. And one of them, for example, there are about 17 studies that have been done using this sort of format. And what they do is they get some participants and they expose them to different types of things. And so some of them, in this study, for example, they expose people to materials-based occupation, imagery-based occupation, and rote exercise, and looked at the differences between those. So for this study, they got materials-based is actually engaging somebody in something that they considered an occupation using real materials. Imagery-based is asking the participants to imagine they're engaging in an occupation, and rote exercise is doing something which isn't an occupation but involves the same sort of requirements. So one study, for example, got a group of elderly people who were living in a nursing home in materials-based to sit around a room in a circle on chairs with a balloon and to play a game of keeping the balloon off the ground. In imagery-based, they got people to sit around in a circle with no balloon and they were asked to imagine they were playing a game of keep the balloon off the ground, and flex and extend their knee as much as they could. In road exercise, they were just asked to sit in a chair and flex and extend their knee as much as they could. And so, as I say, there's been lots of research that's looked at this. The research shows that there isn't much difference in terms of imagery base, so if we take that one out of the mix. However, there is a very big difference between materials-based occupations and rote exercise. So in materials-based occupations, in these sorts of studies, people perform a greater number of repetitions, report greater enjoyment in doing what they're doing, have an increased pain tolerance, they make fewer mistakes, they have an increased heart rate, which means they're working hard but don't necessarily realise they're working that hard, and the quality of their performance is much better. And so the way I interpret this then is that there is a difference between those experiences of sitting there being asked to flex and extend your knee in this case, and sitting there with a group of people playing a game. And to me, that difference is about occupation because of that active, purpose, meaningful context and impact on health. So there's quite a bit of research like that out there. There is another piece of research out there which was done not by some occupational therapists, which again is quite old, where they studied a group of people who were living in the community, and they took some measures in terms of their activity levels, and they looked at a whole range of things, going out to bingo, dancing, going out for walks, and doing a whole range of things. And then they followed those people up for 13 years to look at whether or not their activity, or what we would call occupations at the baseline when they first took all those measurements, did that influence their survival. And so what they found was that there was a difference. The people who were more active survived longer over that 13-year period. Now, when they did this study, they were expecting that some of the physical exercise type activities, such as swimming and chair aerobics and walking, that they would improve someone's longevity. But these researchers, who were some public health doctors, were quite surprised to find that all of those activities improved someone's survival over that 13-year period. And again, from an occupational perspective, that makes sense, because all of those things, playing bingo, going to the movies, going out for dinner with friends, going walking, etc., all impact on people's health in very complex ways. And so at some level, it's not surprising that things that had impacted on their survival. That's just a brief introduction then to the nature of occupation. And so now when we are using that word, we're using it to mean something which is active, purposeful, meaningful, contextualized, and impacts on health. And so that is the end of this lecture. Just a reminder, all occupation is all of those things. See you in class.